Горячее солнце, горячий песок, горячие губы, воды бы глоток.
In 1982, at the annual National Music Festival Song of the Year, Soviet people for the first time watched the music band Yala, who performed a song about a tiny Uzbek town called Uchquduq. The song instantly became a nationwide hit, forever immortalizing the once obscure town in the middle of the Kizilkum Desert. Uchquduq itself wasn't remarkably unique or special in any way. The current Wikipedia page contains only 3 notable facts about Uchquduq. The song by Yala is the first, and the second is the fact that uranium mining was the reason for founding the town in 1958. Meanwhile, the third fact would hardly catch someone's attention. A dry statement that on July 10, 1985, Aeroflot Flight 5143 crashed not far from Uchquduq. What lies behind this short sentence, however, is not just a regular crash, but one that remains secret as the Soviet Union's deadliest air disaster, which took the lives of 200 people, 52 of whom were little children. On July 10, 1985, at 11 p.m., the Tupolev Tu-154 carrying Aeroflot Flight 5143 took off from Karshi Airport and headed to Ufa. According to the investigation report, after reaching an altitude of 5 kilometers, the crew engaged the autopilot and set it for the fastest allowed descent to an altitude of 11,600 meters. The plane reached this altitude at a speed of just 400 kilometers per hour, which was on the edge of the minimum recommended speed for this type of aircraft. At 11:41, to gain some speed, the captain adjusted the autopilot controls, causing the aircraft to make a slight dive, reducing altitude by 70 meters. Then he pulled back on the yoke, raising the aircraft's nose, which in turn triggered the critical angle of attack warning signal, followed by the pre-stall shaking of the plane. The aircraft's speed as a result decreased to 390 km per hour. In such a situation, pushing to full throttle is needed to avoid stalling, but the crew mistook the light aircraft vibration for a compressor stall, a situation where the throttle must be reduced. And that's what the crew did, reducing the thrust, which in turn led to the aircraft losing altitude. After a few seconds, the pilots again pulled the yokes in an attempt to maintain altitude, which once again activated the stall warning. 4 seconds later, the warning signal went silent due to a blow fuse, and the arrow on the gauge stuck in place. In response to the warning signals, the crew pushed the yokes forward. The angle of attack, although slowly decreasing, was still high. The speed dropped to 380. The crew once again raised the nose, which intensified the shaking. The speed meanwhile dropped to 330 km per hour, and the compressor stall indeed started developing in the outer engines. Trying to prevent this, the crew reduced throttle to the minimum, causing a rapid loss of altitude and the speed to drop to 290 km per hour. The aircraft reached critical angle of attack exceeding 20 degrees and then entered a stall, followed by all 3 engines shutting down. The crew called air traffic control and reported that the aircraft was experiencing a chaotic rotation and they were trying to recover from the spin and start the engines. But all their attempts appeared unsuccessful. The plane fell like an autumn leaf for 2 minutes and 33 seconds before crashing in the sands of the Kizilkum Desert, 68 kilometers northeast of the town of Uchquduq. The crash resulted in the loss of all 200 lives on board, making it the largest air disaster in the entire history of Soviet aviation. The aircraft debris were found the next morning, and the investigation began shortly. It concluded that the cause of the crash was the planes entering a flat spin at the Tu-154 practical ceiling, being heavily loaded and influenced by high air temperatures. Additionally, the crew had made several deviations from standard operating procedures, lost speed, and failed to control the aircraft. The pilot's mistakes seemed obvious, and given that the Tupolev Tu-154 always required very strict and precise piloting, the cause of the crash established by the investigation seemed quite accurate and sufficient. However, many ex-Soviet pilots noted that the official investigation report omitted some important details that preceded the crash and which made the cause of the air disaster less absolute. One of the first details of the Flight 5143 tragedy that catches one's attention is the total number who perished: 200 people, consisting of 9 crew members and 191 passengers. The thing is that the maximum passenger capacity of the Tupolev Tu-154B2, which carried Flight 5143, was 180 passengers. The larger number of people in the passenger cabin was explained by the summer holidays and several groups of children traveling. Flight 5143 took on board 25 children from ages 5 to 12 and 27 children of less than 5 years old, for a total of 52 kids. To accommodate them all, some children were seated 2 per chair, while the youngest were seated on their parents' laps. And yet this didn't overweight the aircraft. According to the report, the Tu-154 had 96% of the maximum permitted flight weight. Not long before, the Tupolev Bureau had announced an increase in the Tu-154's maximum flight weight from 70 tons at an altitude of 12,500 meters to 86.5 tons. However, those calculations were made without taking into account deviations in outside air temperatures, which later played a role in the fate of Flight 5143. As the investigation later found out, the temperature of the air at 11,600 meters that day was 16 degrees Celsius higher than normal, which negatively affected the aircraft's flight performance and engine thrust capacity, which usually wouldn't be a crucial issue for any normally loaded Tu-154. However, on that day, Flight 5143 was carrying almost the maximum possible weight. And yet the high temperature conditions were not the decisive factor that crashed Flight 5143. Vladimir Mezhov, an honored test pilot of the USSR, who in particular conducted state tests of the Tu-154 in the 70s, recalled in his book that he was asked to run a simulation of the Uchquduq disaster. While a speed of just 315 km per hour resulted in the same intense shaking of the aircraft, a swift forward push on the yoke quickly brought the aircraft back to normal level flight. Vladimir conducted 2 such simulations, and each time the result was the same, which proved that the Tu-154B aircraft fully complied with the characteristics obtained in state tests. It's worth mentioning that Vladimir Mezhov had also experienced a Tu-154 flat spin in real life. However, this happened during one of the test flights, and his Tu-154 was equipped with an anti-stall parachute, which when released helped the aircraft to lower its nose and thus recover from the spin. But unlike the test aircraft, the standard Tu-154s in service were never equipped with such parachutes. And without the parachute, recovery of a Tu-154 from a flat spin was impossible. Thus, all the pilots were simply taught to never get into a flat spin. So how come the crew of Flight 5143, which was quite an experienced one with both pilots having more than 12,000 flight hours each, made this terrible mistake and got into a flat spin? The most common explanation is that the pilots were simply sleeping. On July 10, 1985, Tu-154 Captain Oleg Belesov and his crew were scheduled to fly the domestic flight route Karshi-Ufa-Leningrad. Since the aircrew was stationed in Tashkent, they were expected to arrive in Karshi at 6 a.m. as passengers on board Tu-154 number 85311. The same plane they were assigned to operate later as the crew for the Ufa and Leningrad flights. Given their scheduled departure from Karshi at 6:45 p.m., their planned 6 a.m. arrival would have given the crew the mandatory 10-hour rest time before their flight, but things didn't go as planned. Early that morning, the crew had arrived at the Tashkent airport, but their flight to Karshi was constantly delayed due to a sandstorm, and they were patiently waiting with the rest of the passengers at the airport. They finally arrived at Karshi at 6:18 p.m. after a long delay, which had already consumed the biggest part of their planned rest time at Karshi. But the worst part was that due to some organizational issues with refueling and required technical procedures, the 85311 wasn't ready for the next flight until 11 p.m. By this time, Belesov's crew had already been awake for at least 20 hours, since even after their arrival in Karshi they couldn't get any rest. The thing is that the Karshi airport was a newly built facility, which normally would be an advantage, but not in the Soviet Union. Typically in the Soviet system, the official opening of finished construction projects were mostly scheduled for sacred communist dates, the birthday of Vladimir Lenin, Labor Day, the October Revolution Day, you name it. The thing is that nobody really cared about the readiness of the object being opened. The primary goal was simply to show in reports and the media that the project was completed on time and commemorated some important communist event or leader. And after that, construction could continue for months and years until the object was brought to full readiness, if it was not forgotten, that is. The recently built Karshi airport was no exception, and Belesov's crew didn't get their rest not because they didn't want to, but simply because there wasn't a proper place for them. And just to remind you, this was in Karshi, Uzbekistan, where the average daytime temperature was around 40 degrees Celsius, with no air conditioners whatsoever. So what happened to the crew? Here's an excerpt from the book Crew Errors by Vasily Yershov, a famous Soviet commercial aviation pilot who spent 35 years in aviation with almost 20,000 flight hours, the majority of which were as a Tu-154 captain. During that time, the new airport in the Uzbek city of Karshi had just been completed and flights were just commencing. There was a terminal, an air traffic control office, and a runway. Amidst the scorching heat, crews jostled without comfort, departing for flights without proper pre-flight rest. Such was the case for this Tu-154 crew. Having spent almost a day on their feet for various reasons in 40-degree heat, they prepared to fly to Leningrad at night. When the entry door closed and the gangway rolled back, the crew were already utterly exhausted from the tumultuous preparations for the departure, yearning only to collapse and fall into a deep sleep. This unfortunate crew took off at their limits. They began climbing on autopilot, their eyes closed. I know very, very well what that's like. I have experienced it 100 times. And they plunged into a deep pilot's slumber. For 10 minutes, the entire crew. The autopilot steadily gained altitude, maintaining the proper pitch angle. Meanwhile, the speed gradually decreased, as did the margin for stalling. If the pilot had been monitoring the speed, he would have slightly reduced the pitch, maintaining the speed, but I suppose they were all asleep, and behind them similarly slept 190 exhausted passengers. The plane climbed to an altitude of 11,600 meters. How it managed to do so in the heat with maximum takeoff weight, I cannot say. Inching upwards at the most critical angle. At a speed of about 400, shaking began. It woke up the crew. The captain thought it was a compressor stall, accompanied by shakings throughout the plane. I can imagine how his heart raced. He probably hadn't encountered a compressor stall before. The phenomena of airflow disruption to the engine due to skewed airflow at high angles of attack. It shakes so much that it's terrifying. It feels like clubs pounding the tail. And the gas temperature rises. The engines need to be immediately throttled down to prevent overheating. But the shaking was weak, barely noticeable. The captain, half asleep out of panic, slightly reduced the throttle without looking at the speed gauge. The flight engineer prevented a complete shutdown of the engines. According to his instruments, there was no surging. The captain reduced the throttle again and disengaged the autopilot. He began to manually control the plane and rocked the aircraft. They held on for almost a minute. According to the investigation report, the angle of attack reached almost 20 degrees. During this time, with no thrust, the speed dropped by almost 100 km per hour and the plane eventually stalled. A swift reaction in that very moment would have saved everyone, to push the yoke as hard as possible, but his sluggish body didn't react, and then it was too late. Erratic control actions began which could not change anything. The plane, in a flat spin, crashed almost vertically into the sand dunes not far from Uchquduq. I suppose they were fatally exhausted. They should have refused. After 20 hours of waiting, looking into the eyes of equally exhausted passengers struggling in the heat alongside the crew, and gone to the rest. Only at that time, there was nowhere to rest in Karshi. All 200 people on board Aeroflot Flight 513 perished, making the tragedy at Uchquduq the deadliest air disaster in Soviet aviation history. Typical for the USSR, the crash remained secret, and the Soviet people continued to joyfully sing about Uchquduq, the lifesaver in the desert. Through all the decades, the Soviet government's approach was straight and simple. If you don't talk about a tragedy, then it never happened. And this was applied to everything, whether it was an air disaster, a serial killer case, or a nuclear power plant explosion. The Soviet Union is long gone. However, in Russia, the Uchquduq song is still quite popular. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with this song itself. What's wrong is that whether it's a concert or in the YouTube comments, the Uchquduq will always be followed by multiple people's regrets. How great the living was in the USSR, how easy and safe it was for regular people, and how nice it would be if someone could bring the USSR back. The Uchquduq air disaster was horrible, but it's not the only one that was kept secret in the USSR. Some of the others maybe had lesser death tolls, but the details and circumstances were sometimes much more shocking. Like the 1986 accident when a Soviet Tu-154 captain made a bet with the co-pilot that he could land the aircraft blindly using only instruments. A deadly bet that resulted in 70 casualties. You can learn more about this tragic episode in my new video, which is coming in a few weeks and which will be the first episode of my new series about Soviet air disasters, available exclusively on Nebula. Nebula is where you can find my other exclusive episodes from Soviet aviation history, like the crazy Soviet attempts to mount huge cannons on light fighters, or the test fights of the captured F-5 Tiger against the MiG-21, which unpleasantly surprised the Soviets, or the fascinating story of the Soviet ghost flight when an Antonov An-12 flew for several hours with an unconscious crew. I'm sure you are well aware of how ruthless YouTube policies are in regards to historical content, and unfortunately many of my videos, since they are related to military or sensitive topics like air disasters, have suffered hard from that. And it's not just that such a video would get demonetized, but the worst thing is that most likely YouTube won't even show it to you. Nebula is not like YouTube, and that changes how I make my videos. I don't need to adjust or cherry-pick historical facts for my video to find a path through YouTube restrictions. On Nebula, I simply don't have any restrictions. My only goal is for you to learn the true story, no matter how shocking its details might be. Nebula is owned directly by us, the creators, and that means your support goes directly into finding more high-quality projects that otherwise would never be made. Sign up for Nebula using the link below and you will get access to tons of premium content for just $2.50 a month. But for a limited time, we're also offering lifetime memberships. A one-time payment lets you access Nebula for as long as both you and Nebula exist. Lifetime memberships are the best way to support Paper Skies and other creators. We are using the money raised to fund the production of even bigger, more ambitious Nebula originals. Sign up for Nebula using my link in the description, and as always, thank you so much for watching.